Good afternoon. I'm Marianne Wilson, editor of Chain Store Age, and I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Lean on Sevan, your EV charging experts and implementing programs for retailers. It's being sponsored by Sevan Multi-Site Solutions. Before we start, I just want to make a few brief housekeeping points. We encourage questions, so please feel free to use the Q&A function to send questions throughout the presentation. It's on the left side of your screen, down below the presenter headshots. We'll field as many questions as we can at the end of the formal presentation. If we don't have time to answer all of the questions, our sponsors will follow up by email after the session concludes. Also, you can also use the section down on the left. If you have any technical questions about the webinar, you'll get a reply from our webinar producer. Finally, if you want to review this webinar later or share it with your colleagues, a replay will be available on the Chain Store Age site within about 2 hours after it concludes. It will remain available for several months. So that does it for the housekeeping. Let's get on with today's webinar. Joining us today is Tom Glatz, Chief Operations Officer for Sevan Multi-Site Solutions, along with the company's Chief Revenue Officer, Jim Furis. We're also going to hear from industry consultant, Peter Boyd. So now I'm going to turn things over to Tom.
Thanks, Marianne. I appreciate that. We're going to just give you a little bit of information about Sevan Multi-Site Solutions, and then we're going to go into our presentation. So Sevan was formed almost 12 years ago with a focus around program management for distributed national and international programs. And Sevan brings to the table 7 lines of business in support of those programs so we can provide end-to-end services. And specifically around EV clients, as you can see on the screen, some of the folks that we've been working with recently have been Walgreens, BP, Walmart, and over in the UK with Motor Fuel Group on installing EV units at their facilities. A couple of the reasons why we're taking a look at coming out and talking to you about EV are some information we found on the growing interest and growing popularity of EV in the market. As you can see on the screen, about 71% of the drivers right now said that they would consider buying an EV car in the future, and a third of those would consider that as their next vehicle. So the interest is growing, and we've seen that in what's happening in the market. It's estimated by about 2030 that more than 50% of the cars on the road will be electric. And from a commercial standpoint, it's projected out that by 2040, both Amazon and FedEx plan about 100% of their fleet to be electric vehicles. And that demand can be shown in this next chart as it's grown from what we're showing in 2011 to a fairly minimal interest and projected out in 2030 to be growing as shown on the screen. So based on what we're seeing in the industry, and I'm sure what each of you is seeing in the market themselves, large continued interest in EV. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the next part of the presentation over to Jim Furis and Peter Boyd, and they're going to touch on the environmental impact of EV, government subsidies, ways to earn revenue, pricing and costs, types of chargers, and EV strategies. And as Marianne mentioned, we'll do a little recap at the end, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim Furis, our Chief Revenue Officer at Sevan Multi-Site.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. We appreciate all the attendees. This is a wonderful group to get together and chat about something that's on a lot of people's minds these days. And as Tom mentioned, the number of EVs that are out there in the market today is comparatively low as a percentage of the vehicles, but that number is going to get a lot bigger over the course of the next few years. So there's lots of interest in how do we get into this world where driver preferences are changing and the electric vehicle is becoming more and more out there in the world needing this service. So one of the things is that's the economics of driving an EV versus driving a fuel-powered car, and the other thing is the environmental impact. So from the side of the environmental, that impact is we're putting together lots of plans for clients to get involved with this, because there's a lot of, call it more of a social appeal for some of the larger companies that want to do this as a way to demonstrate, hey, we're committed to climate, those things that may be going on that are bad for the environment, bad for the climate. We want to mitigate that to the extent possible. So out there, as an example, with the Walgreens program, we installed 50 some chargers for them. There's a little case study that pops up a little bit later in the presentation. But putting in these charging stations was a 91 at about 50, 60 sites. The impact of that was 118,000 free miles for customers. So reducing the carbon emissions by 52,000 pounds, this is kind of a big deal to them. They want to do more of it, and many others would like to do the same. Government trends. Now, this is getting at some of the management of the impacts on the environment. So the U.S. government has introduced a subsidy program to help pay for EV chargers. They also introduced a tax credit for electric vehicles. So they're attempting to steer the market into more and more charging locations for the public. So there's a little bit of presentation on the subsidy element coming into this. We'll see that a little bit later. But you can see here the government's goal is to get to 500,000 charging stations by 2030. That's a big goal. That's a big objective. And there will be a lot of people both on this call and that aren't on the call that will like to get involved with that sooner rather than later. The subsidies and incentives, this is an interesting thing, and these vary a little bit by state. So the federal government has decided that they'll incent the buyers of these by up to 30% of the cost of the EV. And then some of the states cover up to 50 to 100% of the full project cost. So that's going to vary, and it's going to depend on your market and where your proposed location is. But all of that stuff can really be rolled into helping capture the costs on the front end, meaning that there's an incentive to go quicker and get in line for the subsidies rather than wait until they may have been reduced or eliminated altogether. At the same time, there's a concern about, well, how do we make money doing this? Many of our clients who would like to get involved with it don't have a solid answer for that. They know there are many ways to do it, but they're not sure what's the right way for them. The EV charging in private businesses, this is something that's more, say, steered towards maybe not at fuel centers or not at traditional, call it auto service kinds of places. These things can be put in anywhere, really. So it could be at apartment complexes, it could be at parking garages, other places like that, where that could be an additional revenue stream. In some cases, they're charging for the electricity itself. Other cases, there may be a fee to park in a parking garage. It's a higher fee to park in an EV charging space, but while you're there, you can charge your car for free. So those are a couple of things that call it the non-fuels kinds of companies are looking at as ways to get into this game and begin to earn revenue off this coming wave. And the ways to earn it, it's very simple, right? You have the charging revenue itself. So many of you are familiar with, there may be apps out there where if you're driving a Tesla, if you're driving a particular car, if you've got one of the apps for one of the providers that's out there all the time, like a charge point, something like that, where the customer pulls in, plugs in the car, does something through the app. I don't use one, so I'm not sure. But they're just paying for the electricity and the use to be there. Others have a free model, so they might have free charging for the customers, but there's advertising that's part of the charger itself. There's a screen, and they're advertising various products. Could be for the location where the business is. It could be something that's entirely unrelated, but those are captured not through the charging revenue itself, but through the advertising fees. And lastly, the subscription pricing, where you've got monthly models or something like that customers can then use, where they're not necessarily paying for an individual charge, but there's some sort of monthly rate, weekly rate, something like that, where they are able to plug in and charge without an explicit charge for that, a fee for that moment. I'm going to turn it over to talk a little bit about pricing and cost, which is on most people's minds. That'll go over to our industry expert, Peter Boyd. Peter?
Hey, thanks, Jim. So cost, everybody wants to know cost, and it really is interdependent on what you have to work with as a location and a site, and it has some limitations that you have to work with regards to how the current infrastructure, or i.e. the power, is brought into a site. Whereas if you were starting with a blank slate, you might have a lot more liberty there to do something probably more creative. And in this space, you really have to work with what you have, because it will impact your cost, and that means where these things will be located on the site. The other thing to consider is the equipment choice, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we get further in. And it really pertains to what your current offering is how well that works, and what kind of strategy you would have for that, whether it's a slower charge or a quick charge kind of approach. So as I mentioned, the supplying power, you got to work with the utility providers, and that tends to be one of the big challenges, because as you can imagine, as the chart that Tom showed and the growth in this space, there's a lot of demand for those resources from the utility and that attention that you might get. And you're likely to have to include a new power supply to the site, because most sites won't have available extra power, or what we would call future building involved in them. So that'll be a big piece of it. And of course, the number of units that you might propose at that space to what makes sense for your offering. So what to know about the charging is the types of chargers available to you. Good news is that, as we've seen, technology moves rather rapidly, and it's in this space as well. So whereas it initially started out was relatively slow charging, and that's still available, but it's gravitated, and the technology's got it to some offerings that can be very advantageous as well. You really need to consider in that space, and that will balance your cost as well with the dwell times. That's your offering today, and what the customer might do while that vehicle's charging, and how much time they will give, or your offering can give, so that they can get a full charge. Of course, we talked a little bit about the cost considerations, and that always has to be managed into this equation, because at some point the return has to be balanced out to make it all worthwhile in the long run. And then we'll talk a little bit about the steps to installing EV chargers. So the type of EV chargers out there, you'll hear this term L2 chargers. Those typically are 50 kilowatts to up to 400. That's kind of that range for that particular offering. So the lesser the kilowatt, the slower the charge. But they typically provide 18 to 28 miles of range per hour. And that means basically that that's the duration of the charge, but it's all interdependent too on what the vehicle may have, and the temperature outside, and all of that, as you can imagine. It all weighs into that type of charging. And then full charge on that, as it alludes to, 8 to 10 hours. But in some regards, it can be better, just depending on, again, those other factors. The other type of factor or offering here is the direct current, and that's the DC. That's what the cars are built on, is direct current. Whereas at your home or business, it's alternating current. Well, direct current is ubiquitous in the automotive industry, and they've just leveraged that, and it makes most sense. interesting part about that is some of the couplers or the plugins. They've really adapted well so that it can fit various types of vehicles and provide these different types of charge levels. So, and then it can charge the battery up to 80%. And some as little as 20 or 40 minutes. I've actually heard it even get better than that, but that technology, as I said, continues to evolve. So back to you, Jim.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, so EV strategies, this is something that we'll get into a little bit more of the detail, but essentially the stuff that Peter just walked us through with the speed of the chargers, the type of charger, those things are going to vary. What's most advantageous for your business is going to vary. And some of that will be affected by the cost. The high speed chargers just cost more because of the power required. You've got to bring more voltage and amps and whatnot to the site. And you may have to run that quite a ways on the site itself to get to where you would like to install those chargers. So the interesting thing about this is it opens up some different ways of looking at the problem, breaking it down into the ROI on the costs, and opens up, again, more options. So the dwell times we talk about here are broken into the 4 categories, right? The very rapid one. So this customer is not going to spend very much time on the site charging. The short one is in the middle there, 15 to 30 minutes. This is a reasonably good charge if you've got a fast charger. A slow one is going to be not that advantageous for you, but we'll get into that in a second. Then you've got the moderates and the extended. So those would fit more into other types of businesses. Maybe extended would be an apartment complex, parking garage, where a car is going to sit for 6 or 8 hours at a time. And those would be different investments required, probably lower cost, and different ways to price that service. So the rapid charging times, less than 10 minutes. A good example is a convenience store. So those people are going to use the chargers to give them the most benefit, of course. So if they're looking into, I'm going to stop in and grab a cup of coffee, maybe something like that, but I'm not going to be in there very long. I'm not going to sit there and drink it. I'm just going to pop in and pop out. Then those sorts of engagements are going to be the most, where you're going to need the fast chargers to make an impact so that the client is willing to pull in and spend 10 minutes and get, 20, 30, 40% charge out of that. So the amount of revenue generated from the charging is not that much because, of course, it's a short dwell time. And then hopefully the customer is coming into your store, whatever that business is, and spending a few dollars on something else. So it becomes kind of a convenient thing to stop. Let me get a little juice while I'm here, but let me get a cup of coffee and a bagel. I got to get back on the road here in a few minutes. So that's an example of where the fast chargers are going to be the most advantageous and do the most for attracting the customers into the location. The quick charging times are very useful also, and this is not quite to the medium, but getting there. So these customers are going to pull in and stay 15 to 30 minutes. So that opens up a lot more opportunities for businesses. This could also apply to gas stations, but more so maybe with QSRs, maybe coffee shops if they're willing to come in, grab a cup of coffee, sit down, drink that, have a snack or two. In this environment, this is where they can get the DCF chargers. They can get a pretty good charge, 15 to 30 minutes. So these would be very advantageous for that sort of environment. And in this realm, you can charge for the charging event itself. So you're not kind of giving it away for free. There's a way to collect revenue off of this. So there's the opportunity to collect the revenue off the charge itself and off of the ancillary stuff that the customers might buy while they're in the store or at the location. So those are the two more in the fast. Then we get into the moderate charging times, an hour or two. This is where the good examples are gyms, grocery stores, maybe malls. So in this case, the customers can benefit from either the super fast or the medium level charge, because they're going to get enough juice out of it while they're there to add 50, 100, 200 miles to their range while they're just casually going about their business doing other things. And in this case, the number of chargers should be proportionate to how long the customers stay on site. So if you've got lots of people coming into a mall and a lot of them are going to want to charge the car, you're probably going to need more units. And Peter could verify this for us a little later, but I'm guessing that if we're putting in 10, 12 chargers at a location, the cost of each is going to be a little bit lower as you add more, because you're bringing in one set of electrical service lines, all that stuff. So there's an incentive in this case maybe to put in more of the charges you might need today. You might want to build a little bit for the future in those conditions.
Yeah, and one of the things you're going to need to think about too is that, Jim, is that the managing the charging space. You'll see if you go out and look at some of these installed charge posts. There's a lot of direction, and once the charge is complete, they're looking for you to jockey the vehicle out of place to give the next person up. So there's some cultural management in that regard that's probably going to evolve because the limited number of chargers, at least in today's environment. But back to your point about the right size or the right number of units, that's going to go play back all the way back into your strategy and consideration. Even if you didn't put it all in today, you might put it in with the intent to put it in later. You could put pedestals in place to do that, and then drop units at a later time. As you see the growth in that space.
So as an example, you might bring in more electrical capacity today overall into that transformer or that device, figuring you're going to have 12 chargers down the road, but you're only going to do 6 today, something like that.
Yeah, that's true. I think that part of that it's all interdependent on what the utility is willing to provide, so that some coordination there, because they probably won't give you more than you're going to, more kilowatts than you're going to consume in the transformer, but at least you can put the infrastructure in place where it's already there. And if you see the growth, you might add the units, but you also might have to upgrade the transformer at that time with the utility. So it's just to be aware that there's a little bit of balance in all of that would take place as you grow. So.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And the last example here is the extended charging times. This is like more than 4 hours. You can see the example there: condos, apartment complexes, hotels, stadiums, things where the cars are going to sit there for a while. This is a place where a little gentler investment would fit. You can go with the lower end, less expensive chargers, and then the client would pay for that on a per use basis, or one of the other models, a subscription model, something like that. But this is probably the least expensive alternative for installing the charger system, just because of the cost of the units with the slower charge is not quite as high. The installation and maintenance cost considerations, we've published some numbers here. These are sort of general, but it gives you an idea of the L2 versus the super fast chargers and what the differences are in those costs. So we've been saying it's going to cost more to do the fast ones. You need more electrical capacity to run those. The unit itself costs more, but it's a higher value to the client, to the customer, would be willing to pay for that, parking space, pay $20 a day to park or something like that, or if they're going to be there an hour or two, where they can get some sizable charge out of it, get 200 miles, 300 miles, get it up to 70, 80% while they're there. So we're talking about the cost quite a bit, but it will become important. And the model that you want to approach with the slow versus the fast will determine that eventual cost. And then the steps, we're going to turn this back over to Peter to go through the steps.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So when you really come to grips with, hey, this is what I want to do, and how do I go about this? Is there's this, the purchase and lease option, and that will be interdependent on the provider of the units. And there's a wide array of those out there today that are available. They're just a litany of them, and then it comes down to as I mentioned earlier, the layout and how you go about that. You're going to want to engage with a project manager, and really they'll bring on a civil engineer and an electrical engineer to help put this together for you, and lay it out on your site. And there's things that they'll have to be considered, because not knowing what your offering might be, and you've got maybe parking requirements, if you've got to get some variance to that to put these in, they can do those kinds of things, and likely even if you did need a variance, that because of the favorability of electric charging and how it's viewed in today's environment, it's probably a case easily made. You're gonna look at your site survey is going to include an assessment of the power supply. As I said earlier, most sites are not going to have additional power that you can consume. That said, there's always exceptions. Some folks either build that way, or there might be vacancies or and the alike that would allow for that. But you're likely to need a power upgrade, and that would include the utility. Then as you put the package together with both your site design and your electrical, the firm would take it forward and seek permit approvals and entitlements as needed for the site. By and large, I haven't seen a lot of real challenges in the entitlement space. It's not to say there wouldn't be, just depends on where it is. But nonetheless, is that you're still going to have to take your project and get it approved and work with the local regulators to sign off on it, and of course inspect and the alike. And then once you're complete, you can begin offering the service to your customers. So it's again, it's thinking about all that's been said here today so far, is that's kind of preparing you for what you need to be thinking about when if you're going to move forward in this space. So then we talk a little bit about how you try to minimize cost, and I kind of already touched on this. Is the site layout, is that there may be an ideal location for these charge units that would be most desirable and favorable. You have to balance that with where where the power comes in and the associated costs to get that to those locations. And then again is how those impact your parking for your other offering. So you really have to kind of work that out. But cost, typically what I've seen and where I've been involved is that we've moved locations closer to the power because those impact the overall cost. As I mentioned before, you'll likely to have a need for additional utility service, and that includes its own transformer. These units do consume a fair amount of power, depending on the kW that you have, and so there's likely a transformer on site, and that's likely to be a pad-mounted transformer, given the nature and the number of units you would offer. Typically, 4 units, they'll require about a 750 kW transformer, and so those largely don't hang on poles. They have to be pad mounted. So, but some utilities can be creative as well too. So there's a lot of variability in that space. And then the last bullet here, but certainly not least is ADA accessibility. So you need to give these parking spaces enough space so that your disabled customers can utilize these services as well. And you've seen those clearances. You'll see Tesla, for instance, does a nice job of putting a fair amount of space between the units and allows the customer to be able to get around the vehicle. Plus, you've got to get the cable over to the side. And if you think of it in the form of gas stations today, there's, by and large, most gas stations give you plenty of space to get around the vehicle and do what you need to do. And really, that same concept applies here. So just to keep that in mind. The other thing is that could be that the path of travel from these to your offering, as they'll be interconnected, will need to be considered so that the grades are in line with ADA expectations. So just some things to think about. But your civil engineer will be able to solve all of that for you, and as part of the overall program. So Jim talked a bit about some of the subsidies today versus the future, the $7.5 billion that the federal government put into the infrastructure bill. We talked a bit about the dwell times. I mean, really overall, there's a strategy here that meshes well for all the things that are considered with your current offering and what you want to put out there. As it's been touched on throughout the slideshow that just what do you have, how long are these folks going to spend at your facility, and so that really kind of frames up for what you would like to see in that offering. Is it fast charge? Do you have time to give it? And so on. Very important to get the right size, the right fit there. And as I mentioned, if you've got regular traffic coming through, you're going to need to make sure that you manage that too. I believe Tesla, once they get to 80% charge, there's more of a punitive type approach over that 80% charge to get the customer to disengage and relieve the space for somebody else to use it. In all of this, that there's, in my estimation, there's a cultural change coming in how folks really move around and utilize their vehicles. As you can kind of consider, if you think about it, as to how am I going to get from point A to point B, and where is that, and then along the way, your offering might be one of the stops they make. So just keeping that in mind. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Jim.
Thank you. And we've got a couple of case studies here that illustrate, call it the two most likely models, right? So the first example is from the Walgreens program we managed for them a couple of years ago. And we mentioned some numbers earlier in the presentation about 91 stations installed at about 50 sites, 118,000 free miles, 52,000 pounds of carbon emissions, something in that range. But this example is the one where the Walgreens wanted to do this, liked the idea, but didn't understand the costs at the time or how to maximize the returns or any of that. But they liked the idea of having chargers located at their stores. So we did a pilot for them. And this system is one in which the charger and the company providing all of the infrastructure, all that cost stuff that Peter took us through, was all borne by the charging company. So they came to Walgreens and said, we will put all of the material, all the equipment, all the infrastructure, power, everything. We'll install all of that at our cost, and we will lease some property from you. And I don't have any numbers for that, but there's some payment goes to Walgreens as consideration for allowing the chargers to be on their property. So we went through this program, and this is the advertising kind of model. So the charging is done for free to the client, and the payment comes through advertising. You can see the screen there if it's large enough for you, that there's a video screen on the charger itself. And this is how the revenue is generated, by the advertising that's shown while the customers are charging. So in this case, it was a very successful trial. Walgreens as a company hasn't done this at all sites yet. I think they're evaluating and figuring out if they want to do it this way, if they'd like to do it where they're collecting some of the revenue, which requires a different level of investment, a different level of ongoing maintenance, some sort of an app or something like that to generate the revenue through the charging itself. So think of this as one example. This is a way to get this done, to have chargers at your locations for the convenience of your customer, where you probably wouldn't benefit from marginal revenue, meaning the more charges that are being used, you may not benefit from that, but you may benefit from a lease payment. You may work out some other arrangement, but that's one model. And then we'll skip to the next, which was more of the classic, we're going to put it in at our expense, and we're going to charge the customers on a per use basis. So this was in UK, where we manage this program for MFG. Now, Tom mentioned Motor Fuels Group in the beginning of the presentation. They're a UK client of ours. And this is one in which they wanted to put these chargers in. You can tell there's multiple locations here, which is not necessarily related to a fuels station. It might be co-located at a fuels outlet, and it may not be. So the idea here was, all right, we want to do this in various locations. So Sevan, please go to the sites, perform the due diligence for us, conduct a survey of the site, figure out how much power we're going to need, where it's going to come from, all of that planning bit. As Peter said, that all affects the costs, right? Where the things go, how far you have to run this, the power lines from the source, wherever that's coming from, the number of transformers you need, all of that stuff matters. And so in this case, we're figuring it out for them and saying, under these conditions here, if you want to do a dozen charges at this site, here's about how much it's going to cost. Here's how much land you're going to need. Here's how the flow works around the sites. As Peter mentioned, the ADA considerations are important. In UK, it's called something else, but it's the same idea, where we have access for people who are not able to walk on their own or in wheelchairs or something like that, where they need a little extra space or a little extra time to do things. So all of that goes into our planning. It's the civil part, it's the utilities planning, and it's helping them to quantify all the costs ahead of time so that they can justify it within a business model where they're reliant on collecting charger revenue from the customer at the time of the charge. A completely different version from the one we described with Walgreens, which is their revenue is not necessarily connected to that. It's a flat fee or something. It's a lease rate for the charger to sit there where they're sort of renting the property. So these are two extremes. One is the higher cost, but there's a higher payoff. The other is much lower cost to the property owner, but probably not as much upside, but a very good way to get into the business if you're attempting to do it on a trial basis or understand what it's really like. That's a good low-risk way to plunge into this market. So from there, I'm going to turn it back over to Mr. Glatz. Tommy?
Thanks, Jim. Jim just ran through a couple of those case studies and was showing how Sevan was involved. I'm just going to touch on a few other areas that Sevan could bring value to your programs, and then we're going to open it up for some of the questions that may be out there. So as was mentioned, Sevan provides end-to-end services, but you're also able to pick and choose from those services on where we might be able to help supplement your in-house staff. We can provide anything from the initial survey and the feasibility, the capacity, do your concept plans through architectural and engineering, get the final plans together with cost estimates, help you find, bid, and vet general contractors, run you through the permitting, and then eventually do any construction management or project management necessary. That end-to-end service is what we provide across the country and internationally, as mentioned, through some of our customers. So as you're looking at your programs and need either supplemental help with your existing staff or you're looking to offload a program completely, we're well positioned to help you. Sevan as a business, we've really focused on our employees. We take pride in what we call our merit badges that you can see at the bottom right of the presentation. Veteran-owned company and a strong focus on safety. And we're very proud of the badges that we have with regard to safety on what we do every day. And finally, if you want to go to our website, we have a white paper that's available labeled Charging Forward. There's a link in the presentation that will be available to folks, and you can get some additional information from that white paper and contact information as well. With that, I think I'm going to kick it back over to Marianne and see if we have any questions that we could address for the group.
I'm going to start with this one. Are all EV charger ports the same?
So I'll take that one. The answer is no. Right now there's roughly three. There's the Chodra, which is legacy, and it's a slow charge predominantly used with the Leaf, the Nissan Leaf vehicle. And then the level 2 is a J1772, but it's also known as I think it's CSS, and it's multifaceted. It has the ability to charge at the 4 levels that they call. There's the home charge, which is slow charge AC, and then there's a high charge AC. And the difference between the two is the voltage supplied, whether 110 or 240. And then there's the DC slow charge and the DC high charge. But that particular probe is really works well. And then of course Tesla has its own unique charge port itself. So there's really 3, and it's accommodating, and it can do all of that magic in itself. So.
Okay, so here's another question. How long do EV stations take to install?
So I'll take that one as well. Is that typically the installation can take 4 to 6 weeks, and it really depends on how dynamic the site is and how many units are going in and so on. It's also interdependent on the availability of the utility. As the bigger portion of this, I think, that is the front end of the equation, which is the engineering and design, and that's key to the success of the construction. So if that's done thoroughly and correctly and so on, then the construction usually works out quite well. And again, the only other challenge in that you really can't control is the utility provider, because as most utilities are, there's one in your market, and that's who you deal with. So.
Okay, thanks. So someone's asking, if I'm a tenant, how can I make money from EV charging?
I'll take that one, Furis here. There's still some opportunities if you're not the landowner, but you're located there. There are ways to make money with the EV charging. So many of the chargers have screens and call it networking capabilities. So some of that can be used to advertise the businesses that are on the same, call it location as the EV chargers. There are other ways to do the geofencing capabilities. I couldn't tell you how in the world that works, but I know it has to do with apps and customer phones. So as they show up for to transact some business at that property where you may be a tenant, do you have the ability to push notifications or coupons to those app users, who can then use those at the moment for charging or for other things that they may want to come into your business and transact with you while they're there. So there's value in talking with your landlord if they're talking about putting this stuff in. It could be that the chargers are, call it, dedicated to the front of a particular business. Could be a convenience store, could be a QSR, or maybe they're not dedicated to the front of one of the businesses. Perhaps they're over to the side and some of the side parking, or not necessarily located right in front of a business, but you could still take advantage of your business, pushing these notifications and coupons and other things to the customers as they pull up.
Okay, another question. Are there safety concerns with EV chargers?
Yeah, there are, and I'll take that one. Is that you know, as you can imagine, you're working with electricity, and that. But the good news is that the Society of Automotive Engineers have been heavily involved in this, along with the National Electric Code, and so the devices have been designed to engage and disengage without any arcs or any exposure to the electricity. That said, you know, it's important for an operator or owner of these devices to maintain them in good repair, because the you know, cords can get run over and frayed and so on, just like any other electrical cord. So you're going to want to make sure that you pay a lot of attention to that. And then, you know, I think generally speaking, that's the biggest, I think, concern that comes to mind with folks, with, you know, as to how this is done and the exposure there. So.
Okay. And someone else just asked, what exactly does it mean for an EV charger to be networked?
So that network is really just the interconnectivity to the monetary system, right? That is important, because that's the way you generate revenue. So it's actually what I would call the point of sale portion of the device, and it's a factor that is going to be necessary, but it's also part of what you plan for when you connect or set these units on. And these different devices will do that by different means. Largely, it's done by cellular services today. So.
Okay. So someone else is asking, I heard chargers are already becoming obsolete. How do I know my chargers won't become obsolete in a few years?
Well, as Peter mentioned, the networking part of this is important because you're connecting into the payment system. There are other metrics that go into that, like usage rates. You know, how often was this charger used? How many hours last month was a client there? Which you might want to use for allocating future parking spaces or future EV charging stations. So that's very important. And we did a study with another client who had call it an older generation, where they didn't have that connectivity. They just functioned as call it like a electrical socket, essentially. And without that connectivity, it was impossible to figure out how many hours they had been used. They weren't charging discreetly for the use while the car was plugged in. So that's a really important thing. Said all that to say that the newer systems that are being put in today are all set up at 4G or 5G compatibility. As Peter mentioned, most of these things are using cellular service to do the transactions, to do the monitoring of usage rates, all of that with the individual chargers, which will become important to you over time. So those are being built with capabilities today that should be in place, should be fine for a decade or more. Some of the, as I mentioned, some of the original ones that were put in on the low cost model didn't have that capability. So while I wouldn't tell anyone here how to run their business, you should be taking the networked ones, the newer ones that have the full functionality and capability of the analysis of the data, the way to pay for the charge just directly rather than having to give it away. All that would be important, but whatever you buy today, as long as it's in that group, you're going to be fine for 10 years or more.
Okay. We have a question about accessibility. Can EV stations be installed at accessible parking spots?
Yes, and Peter touched on that, the importance of paying attention to these things, where they're located and how they're spaced. So if we think about the ADA conditions, we're all familiar. Some of us may use handicap parking spaces, the blue ones. We all know that there's an additional clearance on one or both sides of those spaces to allow for the special needs of those that accessibility. So it's interesting to me that in California, that if you were to do an EV charging station today on an existing site, the first charger, let's say you put in two, the first one would have to have an accessible parking for a van, like a, for an ADA style unit. And those things are quite a bit wider than the traditional regular old parking spot, right? So there's a area you have to dedicate a little more space if you're doing this in California. But the answer is yes, they can be installed at accessible parking spots. And I don't know the code, Peter, you might be more aware of that than I am, but I think if you're putting in EV at accessible spots, it probably wouldn't, they may not count toward accessible spots for your entire business. You may have to include others for the ADA customers who might not be using the EV charging spots. I'm not sure about that, but it's very easy to design around this. Everyone knows what's required. It's just the number of ADA parking spots might be more than just the ones that are using EV. There may be regulations that say, well, you have people that aren't charging their car, or you got chargers. You have cars charging in the ADA parking spots for 30, 40 minutes. You need two more over by the building, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, those are going to largely be interdependent on the local requirements and as they apply the code. So it's going to depend, and I can't give you a hard and fast in that space.
Okay, here's a question: are charging stations weatherproof?
Yes, they are. They're NEMA 3, and that's the National Electric Code terminology for that, which basically requires their design to be water resistant. Should they be located in concerns where there might be flooding, there'll be a NEMA 6, and that would be interdependent on the local environment. Again, that would be really fleshed out through the civil exercise in the design process to understand what the requirements would be. But yes, they do comply.
Okay, thanks. Another question: does EV charging start at level 2? What about level 1?
Yeah, we don't talk about level 1 very much in this commercial environment. Think of level 1 as something you might have at your house, your home, your apartment complex. So they're a very low level of power. They don't add very many miles per minute that they're charged in. So it takes quite a bit of time to charge at a level 1. So it's really not looked at as being viable for the commercial market. It's more residential or maybe fleets. Maybe it's not even quite good enough for fleets, Peter. I'm not sure about that element, but if you had delivery vans, like we talked about FedEx and Amazon going to 100% of their fleet by 2030, those might be able to use the low rate chargers because they might sit overnight 8 or 10 hours and use that time to charge.
Okay, we have time for one more question. How do I ensure people charging their EVs don't stay in a spot too long?
That's an interesting one, isn't it? So it really depends on the business model, how the customer is being charged or not charged for the consumption. So if you want to make sure your EV spot is being used efficiently, you might think about a hybrid pricing model so that while the customer is in the space and charging, they're being charged by the minute or by the kilowatt hour, whatever the unit is considered, so that the longer they're there, the more it costs. So that's going to tend to push your customers into only consuming as much of the power of the charge and the time in the spot as they need, versus the other way, like in the case study with Walgreens, where these charging units were put in for no expense on Walgreens side, but they don't have a marginal charge for you to use the system. So you pull in, you plug in, you get your power for free, and in theory, you're reading the ads and that's how they're generating their revenue. Obviously, in that condition, there's going to be more likely that the clients are not in a hurry to move their car. They're going to plug it in and they're going to sit there as long as they like. And then they're the slower chargers, so they're more likely to be there for a while. But on the other hand, if it's at a dedicated location, such as a QSR, a convenience store, etc., you might find that advantageous because the clients who are charging may want to come in and spend an hour having lunch and doing some email and just relaxing a little bit. So there are ways to do it, but there are sort of pluses and minuses to either. You might want them to be there a long time, you might not. So bear that in mind when you're making these decisions on the revenue model, the pricing model. What are you really looking for? Are you looking to charge the customers for the electricity, or are you looking to have them hang out in your restaurant for a longer amount of time, so they're buying more of your other products, not necessarily related 100% to the number of kilowatt hours they're consuming to charge their car. Just keep all that in mind. It's very important.
Thanks, Jim. And I think we've run out of time. So I want to thank our speakers again for sharing their expertise with us on this really hot topic. And I want to thank Sevan for sponsoring the webinar. And thanks to all of our attendees for devoting time to be with us today. One last thing. Remember that this webinar will shortly be available on demand, so you can listen to it again if there are things you want to check back on, and you can also share it with your colleagues. Also, if you asked a question and we didn't get to it, you'll get a follow-up answer from our sponsors. I think that's about it. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.